Today on the Home Winemaking channel, I'm going to review these wine kits from Finer Wines that are available on label peelers, and we'll just see if they're worth all the hype or if they're not. I've touched on these a little bit on my Patreon page, where I always kind of dive a little bit deeper into wine topics, and you can check that out at patreon.com/makewine. Now, the claim with these Finer wine kits is that they are basically unpasteurized. They are concentrated through some sort of maybe vacuum distilling process, but they're saying they're not pasteurized, they're just fresh juice concentrate. And the second claim would be that they come with real grape skins. And as we know with red wine, you really just can't make a high quality red wine without those skins. You can try to extract all you want right off the crusher, but no matter what you do, you just cannot get that body that you're looking for without that skin and seed contact time. And then maybe one third thing that you know, these kits differ from maybe a more traditional kit is they also offer seed packs. People don't say a lot of good things about seed tannin. It's a more harsh tannin, but the thing about a red wine is every high quality red wine is fermented for, you know, days and days in contact with all these seeds, and it's a lot of seeds. So that character that you're expecting, that body, that kind of excitement, some of that is coming from those seeds. So if you eliminate that altogether, you end up with often a kind of thin wine with one dimension or no dimensions even, and it's often just some sort of drink with alcohol in it. So that's definitely what these Finer wine kits are attempting to solve, and then we'll kind of talk through them and see how good of a job they're doing at actually solving that problem. I'll first start by saying, so because these are unpasteurized, they're shipped refrigerated, and the packaging is top-notch on these. They're packed in one of those foam cooler packs. The presentation, really good. I don't personally really care, but I will say that they've done a really great job with the packaging. And the other thing is they come with a really nice instruction booklet here, which is really helpful, but I will also mention, every winemaker has their own kind of style, and I like to read what they suggest, but at the same time I've kind of veered off course to what the instructions would suggest to do, and I'll mention how I've done things a little bit differently here. So if we go through kind of what comes in these kits, they come with about 2 gallons of fresh juice concentrate. They normally will come with 2 grape skin packs, but I ordered these with 4 skin packs, and honestly, you just can't have enough skins in any kit like this. Even with 4 skin packs, you're still far below what you're going to have in a wine that's fermented on the skins. So what I find myself doing is kind of trying to supplement with other type of tannin products to kind of build that body back up. One thing I'd like to see them do is put a label on the skin packs, because we know with a red wine, most of the flavor is coming from the skins. And if I get a skin pack that isn't labeled, my suspicion is that it might not be the grapes that are in this kit. It might just be kind of whatever skins they are able to get. So I have some concern about that, and I think, you know, if I could give some advice to Finer wines, it would be, if you're selling say, you know, this kit is called Meritage, which is 60/40 Cab Merlot, maybe just put a sticker that says Meritage on the skins. Realistically, you're not really going to have a blend of 60/40 skins, but that's what I'd probably do. It'd probably make me feel a little bit more warm and fuzzy. The 2 kits that I did choose are, like I said, the Meritage, which is 60/40 Cab Merlot blend, and that'll be like a often what you might find in like a Bordeaux blend, and often even in California, a Cab Merlot blend is pretty common. And then the other one, which is called the Sonoma, which I will mention, they're not actually from Sonoma, so maybe that's a little bit misleading, but stylistically, it's supposed to be a Sonoma style blend, which in this case is Zinfandel, Petite Sirah, and Syrah. So we'll go through kind of what else comes with these kits. The grape seeds, like I mentioned, and again, maybe this is probably asking for too much, but it would also be nice if the seeds were, you know, Cabernet Sauvignon seeds, Merlot seeds, and it said that, because heaven forbid you put like a Concord seed in a red wine. Something like a Concord is just so it's just so intense in that kind of Welch's taste that you could easily end up with a little bit of a Welch's tasting red wine, which certainly can make wine out of those grapes, but I don't want my Cabernet Sauvignon to taste like Welch's grape juice. Some of these packets are a little bit cryptic. So it says packet A, this starter pack purges wine of natural yeast and bacteria, provides a nutrient for the yeast, and fine-tunes acidity. What I can gather is that there's a couple ways you can tune acidity. You can increase the acidity or you can decrease it. So it's either going to be, you know, tartaric acid or some kind of carbonate. And in this case, it's definitely on the carbonate, and it could be calcium carbonate or potassium bicarbonate. And the way I really know that is when I mix it with the wine turns kind of blue. If it were an acid, you'll see the wine will turn almost like neon pink if you were to mix it with a little sample of wine. And of course, you can also check with a pH meter, but once you've done this enough times, you kind of see those kind of telltale obvious signs. What else could be in this is most likely some DAP, which is your kind of basic yeast nutrient, provides nitrogen to help that yeast be happy. And then possibly some potassium metabisulfite, which is really common to add pre-fermentation on anything that is coming straight off the vineyard. It says it purges the wine of natural yeast and bacteria. That's really not necessarily all the way true. You're really never killing the bacteria. All you're doing is suppressing anything that has a more high sensitivity to potassium metabisulfite, whereas wine yeast isn't that sensitive to potassium metabisulfite, so it will happily ferment away while all these other things are just kind of sitting there dormant. And because of that, I do like to treat, you know, anything unpasteurized. My rule of thumb is kind of just assume all the bad bacteria is in it. It comes in off the vineyard. It comes in with what it comes in with. So rather than saying, oh, I better be extra clean or else the wine could go bad, you really just have to say, all right, the wine is contaminated. Now what do I do? How do I treat that wine and leave it in a state that it's never vulnerable to spoilage? Packet B, this is called the yeast starter, yeast activator. I suspect packet B is simply table sugar. Some people like to make a yeast starter with some sugar to kind of really rile up that yeast. I usually won't do that. Normally what I'll do is just simply hydrate the yeast in some lukewarm water, and then the sugar source that I will add once that yeast has become hydrated will be the actual wine must. So I'll start to add some of that to kind of acclimate it not only to the sugars but also to the acids in that wine. So that packet I just didn't use. It's not like going to make a world of difference if you do or don't use it. The yeast that they gave with these kits in both cases is RC212. That's a pretty high quality yeast, and it is a red wine yeast. I found in the past that it can sometimes have relatively high nitrogen needs, but I get the impression that these kits have beyond enough nitrogen. They were just roaring away during fermentation. So, you know, to somebody that might be using grapes, making wine from grapes for the first time, you could end up with some grapes with low nitrogen, and that yeast could fight you a little bit, but these kits, that's just not going to be the case. There's some oak chips for use in primary fermentation, so these are going to be kind of on the lighter toast end. Again, this is a really common thing to do with red wines, and there's a couple of reasons. One, that tannin added during fermentation and that oak added during fermentation can help absorb some of the like the green bell pepper smells and tastes that you're going to get. And adding that extra tannin during fermentation can also help bind up color a little bit better. Packet C, so that's just going to be another dose of yeast nutrient, and that was, without a doubt, that was DAP, diammonium phosphate. Again, just kind of a basic yeast nutrient. I'll be honest, I did add it, but I probably didn't have to. With how kind of vigorous that fermentation was, all signs pointed to that this had, if anything, a surplus of nitrogen versus leaning on the side of being a little bit hungry for nitrogen. Now, there is some risk by adding too much nitrogen. You don't really want, as I said, you kind of have to assume that the wine is contaminated with all the bad stuff. You don't really want to leave a dry wine with a lot of nutrient, because now, you know, the yeast has done its thing, it's ran out of sugar to eat. Eventually, these other, you know, bacteria, like your acetic acid bacteria, could say, I think I want to eat some of that ethanol and help turn this wine into vinegar, and wow, look, I've got all this great nitrogen to help power me through. So normally what I'll try to do when I'm making a wine is give it just enough nutrient to go through fermentation happy, which is really, really important. You don't want any off smells, real bad off smells during fermentation, but not so much nutrient that I'm going to have a surplus when fermentation is complete. Comes with a muslin bag for the grape skins. That makes life a little bit easier. There's lots of talk about sanitizing it and all that, but again, let's just assume that all the bad stuff is in here and we're just going to manage it just as if we were making a wine from fresh grapes. Some oak cubes. I suspect these are probably American oak. They didn't say. That's another thing I wouldn't mind if they would say on the kit. As a winemaker, I always kind of like to know what I have. You know, like if you really love something, you want to be able to repeat it, and the difference between American oak and French oak is relatively substantial. They're actually different species. Packet D, so this is called the finishing pack. This will be for use after fermentation, and it says the finishing pack stunts the yeast and increases SO2 levels to prevent spoilage. So that would indicate that there's sulfur dioxide in one form or another, like potassium metabisulfite or sodium metabisulfite. I don't get the impression that that is in this packet, though. If you take any of those sulfites, add them to water, and even if you get your nose anywhere near that water, it will sting your nose. It's going to smell like a burnt match, so strong that it will. It's very, very, very strong smelling and very evident. It definitely has potassium sorbate in this pack, and for that reason, I actually didn't use this packet. Potassium sorbate is really helpful if you want to make a sweet wine, but if the wine is dry, it's really unnecessary. What it does is it coats the yeast cells to prevent them from multiplying. So you would only ever add this when the wine's already crystal clear and you're pretty sure there's virtually no yeast in there, but you just want to make sure that that one or two, you know, those few rogue cells don't get any ideas and start multiplying into a viable colony again. So that's what you would use potassium sorbate for. The reason you need to be somewhat careful when using it is because if there's malolactic bacteria in the wine, the malolactic bacteria can metabolize the potassium sorbate or the sorbic acid that it puts into the wine and create a byproduct called hexadenol, and that has this really off-putting geranium smell. So for that reason, if you don't need to use it, like if your wine's dry, you just don't use it. And if you do need to use it because you want to leave some residual sugar in your wine, you're always going to well, you could sterile filter the wine, but in that case, now there's no yeast, so again, you don't need it. Or in my case, what I'll always do is I will always make sure that I'm adding an adequate dose of sulfite so that we make sure that malolactic bacteria that might be hiding around in there somewhere, again, doesn't get any ideas. We need to keep it suppressed so that nothing happens later on and we don't have a wine that smells like geraniums. I can also mention these definitely have malic acid in them, which is as to be expected if these are from fresh grape juice. And I suspect they also have a little bit of malolactic bacteria that came in off the vineyard, which again is really common. It would be more uncommon for that not to be the case. If you're dealing with anything fresh out in the vineyard, you can expect probably some wild yeast came in with it, some wild malolactic bacteria came in with it. And the way I know that is because I ran a paper chromatography test on this after fermentation and found that not only did I have some malic acid as expected, I also had some lactic acid, which would indicate that malolactic fermentation was actually already starting to happen. So what I did was you could have just let it go. So you basically would just wait to sulfite that wine, keep an eye maybe on the pH, see if it's going to climb. Or if you want, you can get a paper chromatography kit. I can put a link to one in the video description and just kind of test to make sure malolactic is complete. But if you want to take it one step further, don't mind spending a few bucks, I will add my own culture of malolactic bacteria. In this case, I added Christian Hansen CH35 because it's just what I had laying around. Often I'll add CH16. Both of those are really good strains of malolactic bacteria, really reliable. I always like to hydrate in some warm water first and maybe acclimate them with a teeny bit of apple juice, get a little bit of malic. But what I like about those strains and most cultivated strains is they're really low producers of histamines, because malolactic fermentation, one byproduct is histamine production. And if you know people that get a wine headache, they'll always blame the sulfites, but the more likely thing to blame in that wine is going to be the histamines. Now, I'll just kind of talk about a couple things I did beyond what I've already mentioned, different from the instructions here. I still did yet a couple more different things, and then we'll get into how I would kind of rate these kits. One more thing the kits came with was some fining agents, and as we're saying things I did different, I'm just not going to use those fining agents on a red wine. They're just unnecessary. If you have the patience to let this sit for even a few months before bottling, it's going to clear its own self up. You don't need to use fining agents, and you really don't want to. You don't really want to take more out of the wine than you need to, unless maybe you're somebody who is maybe new to red wine, and you kind of want a thinner wine. You're a little bit maybe not dialed into all the tannin yet. In that case, go for it. But I'm always kind of going for trying to make the most premium wine I can make, and I will almost never use fining agents in red wines. So some other things I've kind of done a little bit different. I will mention there wasn't really a lot of information about fermentation temperature aside from just keeping it warm enough for fermentation to complete, but because I am trying to extract, because I do have skins and seeds, I did let that wine warm up. So I put some seed heaters on it and let it get up to about 85 degrees for a few days to really help aid in that extraction. What else did I do different here? Again, like I said, I've added some malolactic bacteria. I did add some more tannin. The tannin that I added was called FT Rouge. Again, I'll put a link to that in the description. And even tasting these wines today, I still can tell that I'm going to need to put more tannin in one form or another into these. I added some more grape seeds. Same grape seeds. If you're buying the kit, you can also buy more grape seeds. I ended up adding 15 more grams of seeds per kit. I could probably yet again even add even more seeds to these kits. I mentioned that I did put them through malolactic fermentation. And again, I won't let any red wine go into bottle without letting it go through malolactic fermentation, because basically it becomes unstable. It's sooner or later probably going to go through malolactic fermentation. If it happens in the bottle, it's going to get fizzy. And you're also just going to have a weird off taste because you're going to have a lot of malic acid and not a lot of lactic acid. So it's just a little bit off of what a red wine would be if you didn't let it go through malolactic fermentation. But because I let it go through malolactic fermentation, the pH rose a little bit, and also the perception of acid rose a little bit, because lactic acid is a lot more mild tasting and almost like creamy tasting, whereas malic acid is very kind of harsh. So to kind of wake the wine back up again, I did have to add a little bit of tartaric acid back to the wines. I added 7 grams to each of these. I think this Meritage, I'm probably going to end up adding at least another 7 grams just to kind of achieve that expected balance that I want from a red wine. So once malolactic fermentation was complete, because I didn't use the finishing packet from Finer Wines, I did need to sulfite the wines. So I just used some fresh potassium metabisulfite. I sulfited these to 50 parts per million, which works out to about 1/4 of a teaspoon for 6 gallons. These kits for me made about 5 gallons. You might be able to squeak out the almost 6 if you actually run those skins through a wine press. I just squeezed them out in the muslin bags as good as I can. You could have also added a little bit more water to get the full 6 gallons, but honestly, I'm almost always going to ride a little bit on the low side of water with any kits, just to try to build them up as much as I really can. So there's some things that almost every kit has. Every kit I've ever tried has always been very estery, I would describe it as. So those are going to be those candied fruit smells, bubble gum, juicy juice, and very often like artificial banana, like banana runt smells. And I was getting a little bit of that coming off of fermentation, but I would say that it was much lower than I would get with any other kit. I don't know what causes that. I think something about the distillation or the concentration process, and possibly there could be just a little bit of VA, volatile acidity, and when the yeast metabolizes that little teeny bit of vinegar and create these higher alcohols, this isoamyl acetate as a byproduct. In a small enough dose, it can kind of come off as a positive, like a fruity sensation. And I would say we're kind of maybe right now just past where it's a positive. It's still probably leaning towards a negative, but these wines are 2 months old. Like, it's hard to honestly judge a wine that's only 2 months old, and I expect anything that is an ester, so it's really, really volatile, to pretty dramatically decrease as time goes on. So my hope is that that kind of just levels down into oh, this is just a fruit forward wine as time goes on. As for the balance in these wines, still could use even yet a little bit more tannin. The Sonoma was probably the better of the two as far as balance goes. The Meritage could still use a little bit of acid, but that's something I have control over. I can adjust it. I'm never going to use acid blend because I don't want to now introduce malic and even worse citric acid back into here, so I'll just use a little bit more tartaric. Taste it's good, but it's still very kind of one-dimensional. And that's just because these kits are very, very young. Where's it going to go as time goes on? Honestly, it's really hard to say. I would say as far as kits go, I think where we're at right here is we're almost bridging the gap between kind of like your basic kit and your wine that is made from fresh grapes. And I think that is honestly a pretty good achievement, and that does make this a pretty good product to try in the off season when you just can't get good grapes. It's also maybe a good stepping stone. So if you start by making wines from juice buckets, which honestly, let me just say this is definitely higher quality than a juice bucket. But if you start by other kits, this is kind of a step towards making red wine from grapes, and probably a wise step to try. It's probably not quite where I want for, I've got some wines over here that are really, really ultra premium. The grapes are as good as you're ever going to get, and you just honestly can't expect anything like that to compete with this. But can it compete at a level that I can use it as a blender? So maybe if I blend 25% of this ultra premium grape in, now do I have myself a pretty good wine? And I think that could be possible with these. The other thing that could be possible is what I might consider doing is, in the past I've made something called like a second wine, where I ferment on the skins, I press the skins, and instead of just taking them straight to the compost pile, what I'll do is I will add like a kit to those to kind of rehydrate them, and I'll let that ferment again. I'll let the kit ferment in the presence of all those skins. And I think with this being a kit that really does have generally pretty good flavors, no off flavors, that would be something worth doing with these kits. So as far as my recommendation to buy or not to buy, if you're a seasoned winemaker that you've been making wine from grapes for years, this probably just isn't the product for you. If you're relatively new to winemaking, you want to kind of keep expanding your knowledge, keep kind of growing, I would say this is a pretty good buy. It's a pretty reasonable price for the amount of wine that you get. It's going to cost a little bit more than your most basic kit, but as you kind of step up in quality, that's just the way it's going to be. Like when you get into premium wine grapes, you're spending way, way more than these kits cost. You see what I've said I had to do to really try to build these up to the level that I think they need to be. So, just plan to do some experimentation. I think by default, your Cabernet Sauvignon blend is actually going to drink, as far as balance goes, drink a little bit more like maybe a Pinot Noir. And if you're okay with that, leave it be, do that. But if you're expecting a big cab, just recognize that you're going to have to really add a lot of tannin to that wine. I hope this is helpful for you. Please make sure to make any comments in the video if you might have caught something I didn't think about with these kits, or maybe if you have any good ideas to help make these kind of off-season fun projects like the wine kits a little better. Thanks for watching.